Well, Noah's flood is absolutely critical to this question of the history of the earth. And if you study the writings of people who believe in an old earth, most of them ignore the flood. All they look at is Genesis 1 and try to figure out how to fit millions of years into Genesis 1, but they ignore the flood. But the flood is absolutely critical to this question of the age of the earth. So I want to talk to you about the flood, first explaining some of the biblical evidence and then looking at the rocks and the fossils. There are 4 views of the flood that have been held in church history. The first is the historical global catastrophe view. Every one of those words is important. This view says the flood was historical. It happened in time-space history. It was global. It covered the whole planet, so there was no dry land anywhere when the flood reached its highest point. And it was a catastrophe. It was a flood of unimaginable catastrophic destruction. Now that view was the universal belief of the church for 18 centuries. But in the early 19th century, when the idea of millions of years was born, that view began to be rejected, and it was replaced by some other views. One view was that the flood was a historical, local catastrophe. It really happened in time-space history, but it was localized in the Mesopotamian valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq. And it was just described in Genesis in exaggerated language. Other people said, no, it was a global flood, and it was historical, but it was a global tranquil flood. It was so peaceful that it left no geological evidence, and therefore we don't have to try to harmonize the flood with the geological record. Now actually, a global tranquil flood is an oxymoron. As they would say in the South, there ain't no such thing as global tranquil floods. In fact, there's no such thing as a tranquil flood. All floods are destructive. All floods erode material from one place and carry it and deposit it someplace else. A flood that leaves no evidence is really a mythological flood. And so I don't know anyone today who holds to a global tranquil flood. And that leads to the 4th view, and that is the view of liberal theologians that the flood is a myth. If you believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, you can believe in the flood, but it never happened. Just like the ancient Babylonians and the ancient Assyrians and the ancient Egyptians had flood myths, so did the Hebrews. Well, I'm not going to argue for the historicity of the flood tonight, but I want to present to you just a few of the biblical reasons for believing that it was a global catastrophe. First of all, consider the purpose of the flood. The purpose, listen carefully, the purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man. The purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man. Read the text of Genesis. Genesis 6. The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. Verse 13. Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. The purpose of the flood was not to destroy sinful man. The purpose was to destroy sinful man and all the land animals and all the birds and the earth itself. And only a global flood would fulfill that purpose. If the flood was localized, then it wouldn't kill all the animals and all the birds. The animals and the birds living in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia could care less whether there's a flood in the Middle East. Only a global flood will get all the animals. Secondly, the purpose of the ark. The purpose of the ark was not to save a few animals so Noah could start a farm after the flood. The purpose of the ark is very clearly spelled out in Genesis chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Noah, enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. You shall take with you of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean, 2, a male and his female, and also of the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female. Why? To keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. If the flood was local, the ark was completely unnecessary. It was a ridiculous building project for God to give to Noah. All he'd have to do is say, hey, Noah, I'm letting you in on a secret. I'm going to send a flood in your area. Why don't you go on a long vacation to Europe? The animals and the birds have no problem. Animals and birds often sense natural disaster coming, like a forest fire or something. They move out of the danger zone. Even if all of them were killed in the floodplain, in a local flood, animals living outside that would just migrate back in after the flood and repopulate the area. So there'd be no need for a flood. Only a global flood fits the purpose of the ark, because if it was global, there was no place for any creatures to survive. Then the volume of the ark speaks of a global catastrophe. Oftentimes in children's books, we see pictures of Noah's Ark that look something like this. But we've got to scratch this completely from our mind. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The Bible gives the dimensions of the ark. It was 1.5 football fields long. It was about 2/3 of a football field wide, and it was 4 stories tall. It had the capacity of about 560 railroad stock cars. And no boat, as far as we know, was built this big again until about 1860, although we have record of very large vessels built even before the time of Christ, after the flood. So this was a huge, huge boat. And many people will scoff and say, well, there's no way you could fit all of the animals onto the ark. And when they say this, it just shows that they've never done the very simple mathematics. So let's do a little of it to see just how ridiculous this really was or was not. How many animals were on the ark? Well, we have a few facts to take into account from the Genesis record. It tells us that Noah was to take 2 of each kind and 7 of the clean animals. Now, the word kind is very important. It is not the word species. It is not the word genus or family. It's not one of our modern taxonomical terms, but it is the biblical word kind. It's the same word that's used in Genesis 1, where God created the different plants and animals after their kinds. So he used to take 2 of every kind. Well, how big of a category is this biologically? We don't know for sure the genetic boundaries of the Genesis kind, but we have good reasons to think that the original kind was of the dog kind, involved wolves, had the genetic information for wolves, coyotes, dingoes, jackals, and all the varieties of domestic dogs. So when Noah took 2 of the dogs onto the ark, he didn't have to take 2 poodles, 2 Great Danes, 2 Dachshunds. He took 2 of the dog kind that had the genetic information for producing all of this variety after the flood. So kind was certainly not a smaller category than modern species. But for this examination of this question, we're going to make it as hard as we can for Noah. We're going to say he has to take 2 of every species onto the ark. Well, how many species are there? Well, in classifications, we have mammals. There are approximately 3,700 species of mammals, so we'll put all of those on the ark. Now, he wouldn't take all of them on the ark because some mammals live in the ocean, like dolphins, and they're not bothered by floods. They live in the water all the time. Birds, 8,600 species. We'll put all of those on the ark. But some of the birds could have survived outside. Ducks live on the water, and so they potentially could have survived, but we'll put them all on the ark to make it as difficult for Noah as we can. Reptiles, 6,300 reptiles. We'll put them all on the ark. Amphibians, they spend a lot of time in the water, 2,500 species of amphibians. We'll put them all on the ark. Then the rest of the animals all live in the ocean, or they could survive on floating vegetation or in egg form, and so they wouldn't go on the ark. Noah was not told to take any sea creatures on the ark for obvious reasons. So none of those get counted. Let's total them up then. Most of the creatures of the earth live in the ocean or can survive in water, but Noah would have had to take less than 21,000 creatures on the ark. And then we total that up then. We've got 21,000, 2 of each of those. That's 42,000. We'll throw in 7,800 clean animals. That's probably way more than he would have needed. I think there's probably less than 1,000 clean animals, kinds. But we'll make it as hard as we can for Noah. That's a total of 50,000 animals. on the ark. Now remember, we're talking species. Kinds was probably a bigger biological category, therefore the number of kinds would be much less than 50,000, but we're making it as tough as we can for Noah. Could we fit all those animals on the ark? Well, the first thing we need to bear in mind is that the average size of animals is about the size of a sheep. Some animals, like giraffe or elephant, are much bigger than that, but a lot of animals are much smaller than a sheep. Then, what about the larger animals? Well, why did Noah take them on the ark? It was so that they could repopulate the earth after the flood. So Noah would not take the largest ones because the largest ones would also be the oldest. This would particularly have bearing related to dinosaurs. He would not take Grandma and Grandpa elephant on the ark because they wouldn't have reproductive potential after the flood. He'd take teenager elephant on the ark. Then the size of the ark is given here in feet. It was given in the Bible in cubits, which is the distance from the tip of the elbow to the top of the hand, roughly 1.5 feet. And so we have the cubic feet. There were 3 levels. That's about capacity of about 560 railroad stock cars. One car holds 240 sheep. And you say, now wait a minute, Terry. You're packing those in there pretty tight. Well, let's remember, this was a survival journey. This was not a Caribbean cruise where each sheep gets its own private bathroom and kitchenette. Okay, well, we have 50,000 animals at 240 per stock car. That comes out to 208 stock cars, which is only 36% of the ark's capacity, leaving plenty of room for the plant matter that was also taken on the ark at God's command as food for Noah and his family. So there was plenty of room in the ark. And remember now, we're working with species. This is the worst case scenario. If kind was really a bigger genetic category than species, then the number of kinds on the ark was much less than 50,000. But then people still object and say, now wait a minute, you're not going to get those dinosaurs in the ark. Well, there are several factors to consider here. First of all, many of the dinosaurs were much smaller, even at their full size, than a sheep. And then there's the fact that all of the large dinosaurs started out small. The largest dinosaur egg that we have found is about the size of an English rugby football. And so, again, he would not have taken the big ones. And then the evolutionists are notorious for multiplying the number of species. This happens not only in dinosaur research, but also in the study of human evolution. Almost every fossil find gets a new species name, named often after the person who found them. So these are probably a case of multiplying species where there's really no distinction. Again, we see this diversity among dogs, but they're all the dog kind. And here's an example of the ceratopsia. This is probably all one kind, and this variation that we see here is actually less than the dog variation we saw in the previous diagram. So creation scientists believe there were probably only about 50 dinosaur kinds, and some of them were small. Well, there's another evidence of the global catastrophe, and that is the character of the flood. Back in the 19th century, when people were saying that the flood was not violent, they said, there's no evidence in the biblical text that it was a violent catastrophe. And when they said this, it just showed that they didn't read the English or the Hebrew very carefully. In Genesis chapter 7, we're told about the source of the water in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month. On the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open. So the most well-known source of the water was the floodgates of the sky. The next verse says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And I thought that was all the time that it rained until I heard a paper by a Hebrew Old Testament scholar last year in which he argued, and you can go back to the text and look at this, but he argued from the Hebrew, but I think it's also seems clear from the English, that the reference to the 40 days and 40 nights of rain was the time period until the ark started to float, but that the rain actually continued nonstop up until the 150th day. But in any case, this was not a spring rain to water the garden. This was a rain as an expression of the holy wrath of God. This was monsoon rain, 24 hours a day, day and night, for at least 40 days, and all over the earth. It would have caused mudslides that would make the California mudslides look like a Sunday school picnic. But then the primary source of water seems to be from the fountains of the great deep bursting open, because they are the first thing mentioned. And this word, or what we have in English, burst open, is actually one Hebrew verb. The fountains of the great deep refer to subterranean waters. The great deep in the Bible usually refers to the ocean. So this is subterranean water coming in to the oceans. And we have lots and lots of subterranean water on the earth today. Most of our drinking water comes from underground water. And there's hot, briny water coming into the ocean floor even today. Now, burst open. This is a Hebrew word that is used several other places in the Old Testament, and it is loaded with geological significance. It is used in the book of Numbers when Korah rebels against Moses' leadership, and God says, I'm going to judge Korah, and I want the people of Israel to move away from Korah and his livestock and his people and his tents. And the scriptures say that the ground opened. It's the same Hebrew verb. And it was a small earthquake, and their tents and livestock and people went into the ground, and then the ground closed. It's the same word that's used in Judges when Samson was thirsty, and the rock split and water came out. It's the same verb that's used in Zechariah 14:4 when it talks about the second coming of the Messiah, and it says that the Lord's foot will touch the Mount of Olives, and the mountain will split in two, and a huge valley will form. So this verb is loaded with geological significance. It's telling us that the crust of the earth began to break apart all over the earth, and water came onto the earth under high pressure. Whenever we have a volcano or an earthquake on the bottom of the ocean today, it sets off tidal waves. These become what are known as tsunamis as they approach a landmass. And they can go for thousands of miles across the ocean floor at speeds up to 600 miles an hour. And when they rise up and reach the landmass, they can carry ships a mile inland and do incredible damage to the land. So we have evidence of violence at the beginning of the flood. But we also see evidence in the recessional phase of the flood. In Genesis 8:3, it says, the waters receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. This adverb steadily is actually two verbs in the Hebrew, and they are two of the most common verbs in the Hebrew. They are the verb to go and the verb to return. So the waters, literally, the waters are receding, going, and returning in Hebrew. This is moving water. As the waters are receding, they're moving. What does moving water do? It carries sediments. And so in the recessional phase of the flood, the waters are going to be moving. Some of the sediments that were deposited in the first half of the flood are going to be moved somewhere else. Psalm 104 also alludes to the flood. Many people say this is a creation passage, this whole psalm. But I don't think so. I think if we look carefully at verses 8 and 9, it is talking about the flood. It says that the mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth. If that's referring to the third day of creation when God made dry land, then the flood was a violation of that statement. I think that is a statement about the flood. And it tells us that the landmass, the crust of the earth shifted in the recessional stage of the flood. And so the mountains rose and the valleys sank. Now, if you combine earthquakes and volcanoes, like the earthquake that we saw in Turkey a few years ago, with floods, like the one in Nicaragua a few years ago, you are going to have a catastrophe of unimaginable magnitude. Now look at that water. Wouldn't you like to just take a cup and just scoop in there and get a drink? Why does it look so brown? It looks brown because it's carrying sediments. And if we could do a stop-action cut through that water, we would find that that water is not just carrying microscopic particles of silt and maybe some sand grains. It's carrying boulders. And that house didn't last very long, I'm sure. And so the flood was a violent, violent catastrophe. All of the plant materials ripped up off the land. All the land creatures were drowned in the flood, taken from whatever they were hanging on to, and there was massive, massive erosion and sedimentation going on. Then there's the depth of the flood. The Bible tells us how deep it was in Genesis 7. It says, the waters prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. Now, let's suppose that we're all mountains in here, and let's suppose that this little thing here is like Elijah's jar, or was it Elisha, the jar of oil that never ran out. And I start pouring water on the mountains down here. What's going to happen? Well, the water's just going to pile up on top of their head, isn't it? No. It's water seeks a level plane. It's going to run down the shoulders. And so if I want to cover this mountain, I'm going to have to cover a lot of other mountains. But I'm a mountain too, so I've got to keep pouring to cover me. But we got a problem. The doors in the auditorium here are not watertight. The water's going to leak out the doors. It's going to go down the road to the campground here. And then it's going to go down the roads to Harrison. And so I'm going to have to pour a lot of water just to get this mountain covered. The only way to get all the high mountains under heaven covered is a global flood. Those who believe in a local flood believe that it was in the Mesopotamian valley. And to believe in a local flood, you've got to believe in something like this. Now, this is not an actual photograph. This is an artistic design by one of our artists in our office. No such flood really exists in the world, never has. The only way you could have a flood like this is if God put His hands around all that water and kept it all contained. There's a problem with that view, though. There's nothing in the text of Genesis that says God did any kind of supernatural action like that. On the contrary, the whole text of the flood account is going out of its way to tell us He didn't do anything like that He was destroying the whole world. Then finally, for this discussion, the rainbow promise. In Genesis 9, we have the promise that God will never again send a flood on the earth, and the rainbow is the sign of that promise. This passage is one of those passages that causes me to think, you know, Lord, the Bible is awful long, and it takes a lot to read it. It would help if you'd not repeat yourself, you know. Just put it down once, and then we can get on to the next topic. But if you read this passage, God repeats Himself over and over and over again. And that should lead us to a very important Bible study principle. That is, if God repeats Himself, you should say, I think He's trying to emphasize something. And who did God make the promise to? He did not make the promise to Noah. He made the promise to Noah and all of his descendants, the animals and all their offspring, the birds and all their offsprings, and He made the promise to the earth itself. If the flood was local, God lied. Because there have been many local floods that have destroyed some animals and some people and some of the earth. But only a global flood fits the rainbow promise. When God said He would never destroy the earth again, that is exactly what He meant. And therefore, every time we see a rainbow, we should remember that God flooded this world with a global flood. It should be a sober reminder to us of a historical event. Now, what would you expect from a global flood that lasted 371 days, from the day that Noah got on the ark until the day he and the animals came off the ark, as it's described in Genesis? Well, you should expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers that were once soft sediments laid down by water. And you should expect to find that all over the earth. And that's precisely what we find. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. But that rock layer of fossils is a record of death. The evolutionists tell us that's the evidence of millions of years. So you can't really believe in Noah's flood as a global catastrophe and believe in millions of years at the same time. Because If the evidence is evidence of millions of years, if the rock record is evidence of millions of years, then it can't be evidence of Noah's flood. And if it's evidence of Noah's flood, it can't be evidence of millions of years. Now, there are theologians and Bible scholars out there who believe in both a global flood and millions of years, but they haven't thought the issue through. They're being inconsistent. They don't understand the significance of the geological record.